Welcome to Chelsea's Vocation. Chelsea raised 2 children on the autism spectrum, Justice and Noe, into adulthood. They're the reason why she can't help but smile when she recognizes autism in another human, especially a child. Chelsea spent almost 2 decades studying this neurotype as a parent professional, learning how to better adapt her own behavior and the environment around autistic children to both encourage and foster their development. She hopes through this podcast that you might better understand how neurotypical people process your neurology if you're autistic, or how to better yourself as someone who values autistic humans and your relationship with them. Chelsea is a lifelong learner and expects you are too. So don't hesitate to reach out to her through social media comments or the contact form on our website with your own insights. If you're coming to this podcast after the first 5 episodes, you may want to go to the show and review 1 or more of those foundational episodes to know where she's coming from. Either way, we're glad you're here now.
Ableism is defined by Leah Smith for the Center for Disability Rights in her blog posting as follows. Ableism is a set of beliefs or practices that devalue and discriminate against people with physical, intellectual, or psychiatric disabilities, and often rests on the assumption that disabled people need to be, quote unquote, fixed in one form or the other. When I had first heard of ableism as a parent and professional, it didn't rub me the way that it rubs some people when they hear an ism. So if you're already upset by things like sexism or racism, you might put ableism in that camp. But if you're the kind of person who leans in with compassion and curiosity, then I would love for you to really lean into this episode and understand what ableism has to do with autism. Nicole Ciarloni's blog for Partners with Youth with Disability said there are 4 ways ableism still affects people with disabilities. She suggests that low standards, assuming an intellectual disability is alongside another disability, that words are still being associated as insults connected to disability, and the concept of inspiration porn. And if you don't know what inspiration porn is, I'm going to make sure that I link not only this definition of ableism, as well as the Partners for Youth with Disabilities blog, but also Stella Young's TED Talk, which is over 10 years old now, about what inspiration porn is. Basically, people existing while autistic should not be an inspiration for anyone. Their achievements can stand by themselves and have nothing to do with their autism. They're not here to inspire anyone. As a parent who did not grow up with a disability myself, but having 2 children with disabilities, one who really identifies as being disabled and the other who does not, it was a challenge to me to really question my inherent sense of ableism, the unconscious ableism that I probably carried into parenthood, because to be honest, I never considered that I would have 2 children with neurological differences. It was never even on my radar. And that probably by itself is ableist. So I'm really glad that we're talking about this today. A couple of the things that come up when we talk about ableism and autism is really just the way that we've defined autism. When it's defined through the medical model, it really is based on deficits. The medical model criteria were developed without information, without any input from people who were neurodivergent themselves. So it's not like autistics were in the room when they decided what the diagnostic criteria was going to be for autism in the DSM-5. And again, I will link the APA's DSM-5 in the show notes in case you're unfamiliar with that. But that's really where the diagnostic criteria come from. They tend to skew male and they're deficit driven. And that's the medical model of autism, which is really how a lot of parents who aren't autistic themselves are introduced to their children's autism diagnosis. So the social model of disability is different. The social model suggests that because folks with disabilities were not included in systems, environments, and diagnostics when it comes to creating this world that we're existing in, then the nature of these systems, environments, and practices are disabling because we haven't considered those unique needs. So the social model of disability suggests that the deficits are really on the way that society is working against whether intentionally or unintentionally, people with disabilities. And that's what makes it a struggle. So a really easy kind of example is from the standpoint of a wheelchair user. If a wheelchair user is at the base of stairs, they cannot get up into the place where they belong. They can't have any access. And so it's not necessarily that they're in a wheelchair that's a problem. It's that no one considered the access points for that person as a wheelchair user. The neurodiversity paradigm is more of what I've subscribed to. That might be something that you want to go back to episode 1 and learn more about what neurodivergence is, what the neurodiversity paradigm is. The general concept is that there are a lot of different neurotypes that are a natural part of human existence, and autism is one of those neurotypes. So we don't need to necessarily say that having autism is a deficit or it makes someone deficient, it makes someone less than. It just is a different neurotype than others and is a natural form of the human variation. Now, as I was talking to my guest, Sxdni, earlier last week, we were having a conversation about this idea of ableism, the medical model, the social model. And Sxdni has some great thoughts on ableism as a person on the spectrum themselves. And so I'm so glad to welcome you here today, Sxdni. Thank you so much for taking the time with me.
Thank you very much for talking with me as well. I've been excited to be able to be a guest on the podcast. I appreciate the opportunity.
So, Sxdni, I know that not all people who are autistic consider themselves disabled. And I think this is one of the things that makes the autistic community and the spectrum confusing to some people. Because the spectrum is so vast, some consider it to be a disability, others don't. Even within my own family, my son Justice identifies as someone with a disability, and my youngest does not. But based on your lived experience and your connection to the autism community, how does this complicate the conversation about autistic folks and support needs?
Well, I think for me, autism is a disability and a neurotype and a culture. It's multiple things because multiple things can be true at the same time. So that does make it complicated because it can be difficult in this society, this Western literate-based society that's very stratified, for people to deal with nuance in general. And so when something is complicated and fits more than one category, it becomes challenging. That also relates to ableism because the idea of can and can't, that's a very narrow, classically defined, narrow definition if we're talking about the medical model of disability. And ableism is really also about basing one set of standards on what's defined by the majority. So the majority is what gets to define whatever the standard is. And people who meet a certain set of functioning or visible norms within what is valued within the society, they meet the standard. And everyone else is like, less than, over there somewhere, other, or whatever. So there's this immediate dichotomy, the stratification of everybody and then those people. That's also why ableism is an issue and why autism is a topic that can be challenging because it's multiple things, different people, depending on one's background, one's sociocultural perspective, one's age, when they were affirmed or diagnosed as autistic. It presents a very complicated picture, especially because in the past, autism was just one thing. It was represented in the media and in the medical model and in general as just one thing, and someone didn't fit that one thing, then you weren't autistic. It's actually much more complicated than that. Every person is different, and there are also commonalities. There are things that many autistic people tend to have in common, but the saying is, if you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. So there are many differences as well. Autism can also be very changeable on any given day, week, or month within what an autistic person has the ability or capacity to achieve. If one thinks of autism specifically as its disability, then there are laws and medical frameworks around that which can be useful for gaining access. Accessibility, that's very important, especially if people do not have access because they're not diagnosed or affirmed autistic. If they don't have access to those supports and services because they're not clinically, medically, or scientifically validated, then that also becomes problematic and it muddies things because then people might be disbelieved. They might be told, well, you don't look autistic. You're married. You have a job. You don't look autistic. And then again, what does autism look like? There are many, many parts of this that's very complicated. People who have non-stereotypical presentations of autism, people of color, queer folks, AFAB people, women, have historically been missed in their presentation, their neurotype, because originally, as you've touched on, autism was based on little cis white boys who play with trains. And that's a very, very narrow perspective of what autism is. So people who have lower support needs doesn't mean there are not any support needs at all. It just means that myself, for example, my support needs happen to be lower across the board. And doesn't mean that on any given day I may have higher support needs within certain parts of the day and lower in other parts of the day, etc. It presents a lot of challenges, and it's also very exhausting because that means that as someone who does have less classic presentation of autism, I have to advocate for myself, present myself constantly in terms of role switching and code switching. And it's very exhausting to always be trying to navigate that situation as an autistic person.
I've heard it said before, Sxdni, that autistics with low support needs tend not to be believed that they're autistic. And so it's presumed that they don't have those needs. And then for people with high support needs, it's presumed that they're incompetent and that they can't make judgments for themselves. And then, of course, there's everywhere in between. And even people, like you said, might have low support needs in one context and higher support needs in another.
That's exactly right. That's part of asynchronous development and or the spiky profile, which is what I have. It does make it very challenging to gain access to services. No one really gains from having both high-level support needs and lower-level support needs. To have that stratification, again, it's that black and white dichotomizing situation where no one really gains from having that extreme line in place. And I do understand that for people, especially families and parents with kids who have very high support needs, I do honor and acknowledge that that is important to recognize. And I also think that we can recognize that necessity without discrediting people who have lower support needs and saying that those support needs are invalid or not as significant. If we can all work together and say we all have various support needs, we all deserve to be able to live lives of dignity and respect within what we can each achieve. I think that's really significant.
That's such a good point, Sxdni. I'm so glad that you're bringing the folks with high support needs into this conversation as we're talking about ableism. Just because they have high support needs doesn't mean they are any less worthy of dignity and support and respect, right?
Exactly. It has historically been the case that people who have higher support needs have had very horrific experiences in social service settings. That has changed and is still changing. We have to recognize the history and learn from that and go forward and say, how can we make better choices? How can we empower people to live their best lives and be part of the community? And I think ableism relates to that as well, because it's not just about having access to a building, it's about having equal access. So if someone using a wheelchair in the past and still today, if they can't get up the steps, and if they are relegated to having to take a service elevator or go on the back to get into the building, because maybe there's a ramp, but it's not in good repair. It's not usable at the time that they're trying to use it. Maybe it's covered in snow and hasn't been plowed. So there's a ramp, but it's not actually functional at the time that they need to use it. So they're still needing to go, if they can get in at all, around to a different entrance, service entrance, or have someone like carry them or something. And that's not access. That's not full access. That's separate but unequal. So that is not equity.
Absolutely.
Disability as a term does not have to be bad or negative. In this society and others, we've put an implicit bias within that term disability, and we start using other things like special needs. And for me, I and many other people who have disabilities do not like that term special needs, because that relates in some ways as a euphemism for discomfort, disliking, rather not say, etc. And, why don't we just call it what it is? It's a disability. Especially if the person with a disability, if that's what they say for themselves, then that's person-centered, that's empowering. Use that term, not special needs, because everyone has various needs. No one has really special needs. Everyone has needs, and some people have additional and more complicated needs or vacillating needs, but everyone has needs. Calling it special needs, that's like talking about unicorns and fairies. It kind of makes things nice when what's really needed is actual advocacy and change and support in a real world environment.
Oh, that's so well put. I understand this whole special needs, special education stuff that's around when children are small. Certainly that was the only language I had been exposed to at first as my kids were being diagnosed. But the older they got, even without knowing what the term ableism was, because at least in the circles I was running in, it wasn't even really a buzzword until probably, in my experience, about 10 years ago. But I became increasingly uncomfortable with this special needs phrase because it felt so infantilizing. So
Mhm.
here my son was approaching adulthood and people are still saying he has special needs. I'm like, he has needs. He's a human. I have needs. I'm a human. Stop calling it special needs. He's autistic. And I think that's the differentiation between that identity first and person first language. And like you said, it's really important to check in with the person who you're supporting or who you're alongside or you're befriending. How do they refer to themselves? Do they use person first language? Do they use identity first language? Do they call themselves disabled? Do they not consider that they have a disability? I was even just talking to someone yesterday and I said, do you like this term neurospicy? Because I like this term neurospicy.
I do
And she
too.
said, you know what? I like it when people who are neurospicy talk about themselves that way because that's fine. She's like, but I don't want you talking about neurospicy. You can say neurodivergent. And I appreciate that. She's right.
Exactly. Well, that's the idea overall across categories. When a marginalized group says, these are the terms that we want to use, this is how we see ourselves, this is how we experience harm, then one believes the members of the marginalized group because they are the ones who have the expert knowledge of their own lived experience.
So important. And this is why it's about leaning in with compassion and curiosity, right? I think it's so important to be a lifelong learner. And there's nothing wrong with learning better and doing better. It's not about being right, it's about getting it right. And that's going to take some compassion, empathy, listening, humility to do that with different populations.
Exactly. And I think that goes back to the messages that society tells families, tells parents. If there's a concern or a difference or whatever, the response often is, I'm so sorry, or I hate to be the one to tell you this, or I must inform you, or, we think there's a problem. And all these things that start from a very, very early age, a very, very early time in the parent and the family's life with their very new child. There's all that implication and all that bias and that sense of doom and, oh, now what are we going to do here? And that parents absorb. I was born very premature, so my mom told me stories about that experience and what she and my dad experienced. I was born 2 or 3 months premature and I weighed like 2 pounds. There's so much going on and families have situations like that. So they absorb these things in their interactions and in their desire to have their child succeed in the way that societies measure success. If the child doesn't fit that, it's very scary. And so fear, any kind of fear, brings out responses that may be difficult, may be hurtful, may be harmful, may be not in the best interest of the child or the family. It's a fear of not being enough, a fear of not having done the right thing. Did I cause this? A fear of what is my child going to be able to do when they get older, or are they going to be able to do this and this, like my friend's child, etc. I mean, there's all that in there, and it's very difficult for families and parents when they receive messages of what their lives and their child's life is supposed to be like. It's all right that that's not going to be. Maybe that way people need to sometimes get assistance to be able to reframe their thinking to say, well, something different is going to happen now. It might not be what you hoped for or the plan you had. That doesn't mean that's bad. That's a tragedy. It just means that's different. And I will also add that it's important to recognize that within the autism community, there are behaviors that some people who have high support needs have that do present very difficult and life-threatening and very hard, painful situations that are connected to and separate from sometimes the autism itself. I don't want to not acknowledge or to disregard those situations and say, well, autism is all about being quirky and it's a superpower and everything, because there are certain experiences and situations where, yeah, there are extreme challenges and safety needs, and that needs to be addressed, that needs to be recognized and supported.
I have a question for you about your childhood, Sxdni. I know we talked about your being affirmed with autism didn't happen until the last few years, but like you said, you had an IEP in school for other aspects of learning difference. Do you remember, even though ableism wasn't something that we talked about when you were in school, did you have experiences that stood out to you now as you reflect as being ableist when you were in school?
Yes, I've had many. I mean, I've been called the R word as a child. I was in special ed. It was pull-out resource room, segregated special ed at that time. I remember being in that section of the building, and it even felt and smelled different to me. And I remember going past the room where there was a child who I believe had a helmet on and was rocking like I'm doing now. And I think rocking is fine. But at the time, once again, we're talking about as a child in particular and absorbed implicit bias of what was expected, what was appropriate, in quotes. They were banging their head and so on. And I picked up on it because I was a high empath child and still am a very high empath. It's part of my profile. And I picked up on the idea of what should and shouldn't be done, what was and wasn't appropriate. I learned that it was better to act this way and not that way and so on. It was just one of those things that I picked up on as a kid. It comes from also my ability to mask. Not everyone can mask. I have been very high masking. So that was one experience. Sometime before high school, I was in a segregated gym class. It was a very spur of the moment decision on the part of the gym teacher. There was no due process. There was nothing. It was just like, there's a bunch of kids who aren't doing very well or don't fit in for whatever reasons. Let's put them all in this room off the main gym and give them an assignment and let them do that. And they're all going to be in this group. And the rest of the students who are neurotypical or performing in a way that the teacher thought was appropriate, they all stay outside in the main gym room and everyone else goes in this utility space or this extra room off the main gym. The teacher would give us exercises or activities to do. And then she would leave or they would leave and they would go and lock the doors and we'd be in there. And then they would come back and check what we'd done or say, okay, now demonstrate such and such exercise or whatever it was. That did not last very long because my folks found out about that and they were pretty upset. So that was one experience. It was just a bunch of kids who were in various ways different. And some of the kids who were in that class were also kids who happened to bully me because I was extensively bullied physically and emotionally and verbally as a child prior to high school in multiple settings across the board. I was also forced to play team sports in elementary and middle school, which was horrific because I suspect I have dyspraxia, I'm pretty sure. And I also have auditory processing disorder. So things like motor skills, physical movement, coordination skills, multi-step directions can be very challenging for me. I mix up left and right. It was very difficult for me to play team sports because something would be explained to me and I might even see it, but that didn't mean I actually understood what I was supposed to do. Placed on a team and expected to perform with kids who were performing in front of the teachers who saw this going on. It didn't really work well for me. I was very scared of the balls and of the equipment oftentimes and having a lot of difficulty actually navigating the game and wasn't able to explain why. I was overwhelmed most of the time and very scared to be in that type of situation. At one point, I just refused to play volleyball. I just said, nope, I'm not playing. I'm going to go sit over here on the bleachers and draw horses and dogs. I did that at home. I sat for hours and drew horses and dogs. The teacher saw that, and I got in trouble for doing that, and there was no actual investigation or acknowledgement as to why I might have been doing that or what was the cause of that or anything. I just got in trouble for refusing to play, and I was forced to go back and play. So those are some of the various instances in which I experienced difficulty.
I'm so sorry for those experiences. It really speaks to the damage that can be done when we lack nuance, compassion, and curiosity. Even though it's called an individualized education plan, sometimes it's just this A group or this B group, and you're in one or the other without accommodation, just a space. I'm so glad that your parents were as involved in your education as they were. It's your parents and the ones who made sure that the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act got actually implemented, and those teachers who understand the spirit of the law more than the letter of the law, and they're really making sure that they're doing right by learners. I appreciate all of them who've gone before because it certainly made my job as a parent easier. I remember reading an article that the stress level that mothers in particular of kids with autism can carry with them from a hypervigilance standpoint, wanting to make sure that your child is understood, that they're safe, that they're cared for well. It can be a lot for all of us, but I think all of us that have done that work, your parents included, yourself right now as an advocate especially included, is going to make the way smoother for all of those who come currently and after us. I think it helps those of us parents who might be raising neurodivergent kids and haven't been diagnosed or haven't been affirmed with any aspect of neurodivergence. Sometimes we put what we think of our own experience onto our kids, and that's their experience. Part of ableism that makes me worried is that parents aren't believing their kids when they show you what they need. And supporting that need is really helping your human to be the best version of themselves they can be.
Exactly.
I've definitely appreciated this conversation, and I hope what people take away from this episode is that there is a thing called ableism, and it shows up in ways that we might not be expecting. It might show up in our own prejudices, our own implicit bias, our own subconscious attitudes, and then that might get played out in our parenting, in the way that we educate folks, in the way that we're perceiving maybe seeing a 10-year-old in a grocery store having what his parents probably know as a meltdown, but what you might look at as a tantrum, and having judgment for that. Kind of leaning into that compassion, that curiosity, that nuance, knowing that autism does not mean less than, but certainly understanding that it might come with some support needs that are more than worthy of providing to make sure that that person can show up as their happiest, healthiest, fullest self, and to make sure that the families who need extra supports for folks who do have high support needs get them readily, quickly, and successfully, to make sure that they can help their loved one have the best life possible. Sxdni, thank you so much for being my guest today and taking this time. I really appreciate you. If my listeners on here are show notes people, there's going to be so many good resources in there. Sxdni has touched on a lot of things, and if you want to dive deeper, trust me, they're all going to be in there. Go down the rabbit hole. I wish you all the very best.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Chelsea's Vocation. We hope it was valuable to you. If it was, we'd appreciate you sharing it with someone, reviewing it, and/or rating it. Subscribe to the podcast to be notified when new episodes are published. We wish you the best as you learn, maybe unlearn, and do better for yourself and those around you. Chelsea encourages you to be gentle with yourself, be gracious with others, and be protective of your own and others' dignity. Until next time, take care.